The fluorescent glow of the office building floor with too many cubicles cast a sickly pallor over everything, transforming the vibrant green of my desk plant into a pale, suffering imitation. Each desk, a uniform island of muted gray, was a testament to the quiet, methodical work performed within these walls. Mine, however, was a fortress of precision. My drafting pens lay aligned with military exactitude, their fine tips gleaming. The stack of topographical surveys, bound with neat twine, ascended in a gradient of geological ages. I, Reid, found solace in the absolute, the verifiable, the unwavering truth of latitude and longitude. My world was one of elegant lines and irrefutable contours, of mountains and rivers reduced to their essential, beautiful forms. I lived for the quiet hum of the plotting machine, the satisfying thwip of a fresh sheet of vellum. Every stroke I laid down was a whisper of certainty, a bulwark against the vast, formless unknown. The air, usually a sterile blend of recycled oxygen and printer toner, seemed to thicken one Tuesday afternoon. A junior colleague, a young woman whose perpetually furrowed brow spoke of endless spreadsheets, approached my cubicle with a hesitant air. A solicitor called, "Reid," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the rhythmic click-clack of a nearby keyboard. "Urgent. About your family." Family. The word felt like a foreign object, dredged from a forgotten crypt. My lineage was a dusty tome, rarely opened, its pages brittle with disinterest. My parents had passed years ago, leaving me their quiet precision, but little else of note. The solicitor's name, when the colleague relayed it, stirred no recognition. Yet, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor, like the first distant rumble of an unseen storm, began to ripple beneath my composure. The estate. That was the word the solicitor used, his voice a dry rustle over the telephone. A remote, decaying ancestral estate, a forgotten corner of my family's distant past, now inexplicably mine. The news arrived like a rogue wave, threatening to capsize the carefully constructed vessel of my routine. I, who mapped the world with unwavering lines, now found myself untethered, adrift towards an unknown shore. Days later, I stood on that shore. The estate, when I finally reached it after hours of winding roads that narrowed to little more than overgrown tracks, was a skeletal silhouette against a bruised sky. The house, an edifice of crumbling stone and sagging timbers, exhaled the scent of damp earth and forgotten things. Its windows, like vacant eyes, stared out over an untamed landscape where ancient oaks twisted their gnarled limbs towards a perpetually gray heaven. The air was thick with the tang of decaying leaves and the distant, mournful cry of some unseen bird. Inside, the silence was absolute, broken only by the groan of settling wood and the soft scuttling of unseen creatures. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light that pierced the grimy windows. The solicitor, a man of precise movements and even more precise language, led me through echoing, cavernous rooms filled with shrouded furniture and the ghosts of generations. He spoke of deeds and wills, of easements and boundaries, his words a monotonous drone against the overwhelming presence of the house. It was in a small, cramped study, tucked away at the back of the house, that I found it. The room smelled of mildew and dry rot, but beneath that, a faint, metallic tang, like old copper. The solicitor pointed to a heavy, iron-bound chest, its surface pitted with age. "Among your ancestors' effects," he stated, his voice devoid of inflection. "They believed you, with your particular talents, would appreciate this." My fingers, usually so steady, trembled slightly as I unlatched the heavy clasps. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a map. It was unlike any I had ever seen. Drawn on a thick, almost leathery vellum, its edges were frayed and discolored, the parchment itself brittle with the passage of centuries. The inks, once vibrant, had softened to shades of sepia and moss green, yet their precision was breathtaking. Every contour, every ancient tree line, every meandering stream of the estate was rendered with an obsessive, almost microscopic detail. I traced a finger over the delicate lines depicting a long-vanished hedgerow, feeling the slight raised texture of the ink. It was an exquisite piece of cartography, a masterwork of observation. But then, the anomalies. Certain areas of the map were unsettlingly blank, vast swaths of the estate simply absent, as if the cartographer had deliberately chosen not to depict them. And where there should have been the familiar symbols for marshland or bedrock, there were instead strange, intricate glyphs, looping patterns that seemed to writhe on the page, like petrified insects. They bore no resemblance to any cartographic notation I had ever encountered. They were angular, almost violent, hinting at something buried, something hidden. My professional curiosity, a keen and reliable instrument, sharpened to an almost painful edge. What kind of cartographer would leave such an incomplete work? What did these symbols signify? This was not merely a missing piece, it was a deliberate omission, a purposeful void. The map felt less like a record and more like a riddle, an invitation to a terrifying game. The estate, and this unsettling parchment, had found me. And I, Reid, suddenly felt a terrible, inexplicable compulsion to complete it. The map, brittle and ancient beneath my fingertips, hummed with a silent, unsettling energy. Its vellum surface, a landscape of intricate lines and faded symbols, seemed to breathe. The previous chapter's ending left me with the map in my hands, its edges frayed, its purpose unclear. For days, I pored over it, my ancestral estate a blur beyond my study window. The map revealed contours and features utterly absent from the modern surveys I possessed, a small, circular clearing here, a winding, narrow path there, all rendered with an obsessive attention to detail that prickled the hairs on my arms. My professional duty, the very core of my being, demanded verification. I needed to cross-reference, to find corroboration in the cold, hard facts of recorded history. This quest for objective truth led me, reluctantly, away from the estate's quiet decay and into the jarring reality of the city. The air, thick with the scent of recycled paper and stale coffee, felt alien after the estate's damp earth and aged wood. I spent hours hunched over microfiche readers, my eyes straining against the glare, sifting through property deeds, ancient land grants, and topographical surveys spanning centuries. There was no record of the small, stone-lined well depicted in the map's western quadrant, no mention of the cluster of standing stones on the northern ridge, nor the unsettlingly regular pattern of shallow depressions near what the map labeled, in archaic script, as the Silent Grove. The modern world, with all its meticulous record-keeping, simply did not acknowledge these features. It was as if a significant portion of my inheritance, as depicted on this ancient vellum, had been deliberately erased from public memory. Frustration, a dull, persistent thrum, propelled me back to the estate, the map now a heavier burden in my satchel. My boots crunched on fallen leaves and brittle twigs, each step a deliberate act of mapping the present against the past. I started at the edge of the property, where the map indicated a boundary marker of unusual design. What I found was a simple, moss-covered stone, indistinguishable from dozens of others. Yet, as I traced the map's line with my finger, I noticed a subtle divergence. The map showed a series of 3 such stones, leading to a small, enclosed space. On the ground, only 2 were visible. The third, if it ever existed, was swallowed by a dense thicket of blackberry bushes and gnarled ivy. With a heavy trowel, I began to clear the undergrowth, the thorny branches snagging at my clothes, the earthy smell of decay rising with each disturbed clump of soil. Beneath the tangled mass, I unearthed not a stone, but a flattened, circular mound, too uniform to be natural. Further north, the map detailed an old watchman's hut, a structure of some size. I navigated by compass and the sun's fading light, pushing through overgrown paths that barely qualified as trails. It was a pocket of frigid air, sharp and unmoving, that seemed to cling to the very fabric of the trees. There was no hut. Only a chaotic jumble of weathered stones, partially swallowed by the earth, covered in a thick, velvety moss that seemed to absorb all light. These weren't the remnants of a collapsed building, they were too haphazard, too ancient, arranged in a way that suggested a purpose far removed from mere shelter. Their placement felt deliberate, almost ritualistic, a silent, stony declaration. They seemed to possess a weight, a density, that made the very air around them feel heavy. As I surveyed the scene, a sound, faint and fleeting, brushed against my hearing. It was not the rustle of leaves, nor the call of a bird. It was a low, resonant hum, like a distant, mournful chord, too deep to be natural, too sustained to be an echo. It seemed to emanate from beneath the earth itself, a vibration felt more in the soles of my feet than heard with my ears. I froze, trowel still in hand, my breath catching in my throat. My heart, usually a steady drum, began an erratic, anxious beat. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and fiery oranges, but the colors offered no warmth. I clutched it tighter, its stiff vellum a strange comfort against the growing unease that coiled in my gut. What else lay hidden beneath the tangled roots and forgotten earth of my ancestral home? And what, precisely, was listening? This was more than just old paper and faded ink. Here, amidst the empty desks and silent computers, I'd spread my research, poring over land deeds, family journals, and the enigmatic map itself. The fluorescent lights hummed a constant, low thrum, a mechanical heartbeat that was supposed to keep the encroaching quiet at bay. Yet, even here, far from the estate's ancient stones, its presence began to assert itself. It started subtly. A flicker in my peripheral vision, a shadow that wasn't there when I turned my head. Just the way the light caught the edge of a cubicle wall, I told myself, or a trick of tired eyes. But the occurrences grew bolder, more frequent. I would glance up from a particularly dense passage in an ancestor's diary, convinced I'd seen a form coalesce and then dissolve between the rows of partitions, a fleeting impression of something gaunt and impossibly tall. The air, already stale with the scent of disinfectant and forgotten coffee, would sometimes grow heavy, thick with an odor I couldn't quite place, damp earth and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood mixed with rain. Then came the sounds. Not the expected creaks of an old building settling, nor the distant drone of city traffic. These were intimate, insidious. Whispers, like dry leaves skittering across a stone floor, or the rustle of an unseen garment. They would coil around my hearing, just at the edge of comprehension, a murmur of forgotten tongues or the tortured breath of something trapped. I'd freeze, pen poised over paper, straining to catch a coherent syllable, but they would always recede, leaving behind only the relentless hum of the lights and the frantic beat of my own heart. I tried to rationalize it all. Stress, the isolation of the estate, the sheer volume of historical data I was attempting to process. Yet, the foundations of that fortress were beginning to crack. A stack of land surveys, which I distinctly remembered placing on the right side of my desk, now sat askew on the left. My fountain pen, capped and tucked securely into its leather case, was lying uncapped beside a half-empty mug. I was meticulous, painstakingly so. These were not my errors. The map itself, my central obsession, began to mirror the subtle shifts in my perception. I had left it pinned flat, its vellum surface smooth and unyielding. But now, when I returned to it, new lines seemed to have etched themselves onto its surface, fine as spider silk, tracing paths I hadn't noticed before. The faded symbols, which I had painstakingly catalogued and cross-referenced, seemed to subtly reconfigure themselves, their ancient glyphs twisting into new, unsettling forms. Below it, a new, jagged line had appeared, a crude representation of something buried, something with sharp, irregular edges. My cartographer's tools, my magnifying glass, my calipers, my compass, they offered no logical explanation. The map was not merely old, it was alive. And it was changing, revealing not just hidden features of the land, but something far more sinister, something that stirred in the ancient soil and now reached out, subtly, insidiously, even into this desolate, modern space, demanding my attention, demanding my fear. This was no mere survey, it was a riddle etched in skin and ink, demanding more than just an educated guess. It demanded an excavation, not of earth, but of memory, of history, of the very soil from which my lineage sprang. The air, thick with the scent of ozone and aging paper, felt heavy. Fluorescent lights, a sickly yellow, hummed a constant, low thrum, a sound that grated against the silence I had grown accustomed to in the estate. Days bled into a blur of frantic turning pages, my fingers stained with the fine powder of forgotten decades. I sifted through property deeds, census records, local newspaper clippings, the mundane detritus of lives long past. Most entries were unremarkable, chronicles of births, deaths, taxes paid, crops harvested. The land, in official records, seemed stubbornly ordinary. Then, tucked away in a mislabeled box marked Miscellaneous Local Curiosities, I found it. A collection of bound journals, their leather covers cracked and flaking, their pages brittle with the passage of time. They bore no official stamp, no library accession number, only the spidery script of an ancestor, a distant cousin named Elias, who had lived on the estate in the late 19th century. The livestock are ill at ease. The old well. It murmurs. My gaze flew to the map, to a small, almost imperceptible circle marked near the oldest part of the estate, where a dried-up well shaft was known to exist. Elias documented the gradual disappearances, first, a farmhand, then a local wanderer, finally, a child from a neighboring farm. Always, they vanished near the estate, near the locations now so eerily marked on my inherited vellum. The local constable, a pragmatic man according to Elias, dismissed them as runaways or accidents, but Elias knew. He felt it. They were from a distant relative, a woman who had left the estate generations ago, written to Elias. It always has. Our blood is tied to its hunger. Do not seek what lies beneath the weeping stone. It is not slumbering, only waiting. The weeping stone. I remembered it, a massive, moss-covered boulder near the old creek bed, one of the more prominent, yet unexplained, symbols on my map. My breath hitched. My logical mind, a fortress of reason, felt the first cracks appear in its foundation. The journal spoke of madness, of family members succumbing to inexplicable melancholia, of visions and voices that drove them to despair, or worse, to the land itself, never to return. Elias's final entries were fragmented, almost delirious. It calls to me now, from the deep places. It knows my name. The sterile hum of the cubicle farm, the rustle of other researchers, faded into a distant drone. All I could hear was Elias's desperate voice, echoing from the brittle pages, and the silent, insistent thrum of the map, now lying open on my own desk back at the estate. It wasn't just a guide anymore. It was a key, a blueprint to something malevolent, something ancient and hungry, buried beneath the very ground I walked, and inextricably linked to the blood that ran in my veins. The map wasn't merely showing me where things were, it was showing me where things had happened, and where they might happen again. And I, Reid, the cartographer, was now caught within its terrible design. This was no mere parchment, it was a conduit, a pulsing membrane between my world and something else. The air in my study grew heavy, dense with an odor like damp earth and forgotten copper. A chill, sharper than any draft, crept up my spine, raising a fine down on my arms. The room, usually a sanctuary of quiet focus, began to press in, its shadows deepening beyond the reach of the lamp. But the map pulsed, a faint thrumming I felt more in my bones than heard with my ears. Then, a flicker. Not of the lamp, but of the entire room. The familiar oak panels, the stacks of books, the very air, they shimmered, momentarily replaced. I blinked, my vision seizing, and for a terrifying instant, I was no longer in my study. The fluorescent hum, the faint clatter of keyboards, the muted murmur of distant conversations, they assaulted my senses. I saw the drab fabric walls, the neat rows of empty chairs, the monitors glowing with spectral light. It was a place I had never truly known, yet it felt acutely, terrifyingly real. Just as quickly, the vision fractured, peeling away like old paint. The fluorescent hum dissolved into the rustle of the map beneath my fingers, the metallic tang replaced by the earthy scent of the house. The sudden transition left me reeling, my perception of reality fractured. What was that? A hallucination? A memory of a place I'd seen in a dream? The entity, I realized with a sickening lurch, was no longer content to merely whisper in the periphery of my sleep. It was reaching, tearing at the fabric of my waking mind. They seemed to emanate from the very vellum of the map, rising like an exhalation. Ours. It is ours, the voice rasped, low and resonant, yet fragmented, as if many mouths spoke at once. Then, sharper, more insistent, you will complete for the turning. My hand trembled, my fingers recoiling from the ancient parchment as if burned. The words were not just heard, they were felt, vibrating through my skull, a violation of my inner sanctum. This was no trick of the mind, no overactive imagination. This was direct, malevolent communication. A sudden, violent tremor shook the study. The heavy oak door, previously latched, slammed shut with an echoing boom that vibrated through the floorboards. On my desk, a brass compass skittered across the polished wood, stopping inches from the edge. Books on the shelves shifted, a few toppling to the floor with dull thuds. I pushed back from the desk, overturning my chair with a clatter, my gaze darting around the room, searching for an origin, a source. I needed to reach someone. Anyone. My trembling fingers fumbled for my phone. No signal. I tried the landline, my hand shaking so violently I nearly dropped the receiver. A dial tone, blessed and ordinary, filled my ear. I punched in the number of a colleague, a fellow cartographer who shared my passion for the obscure. The phone rang once, twice, then a click. "Hello," his voice, distant and tinny, sounded like an anchor in a storm. "It's Reid," I choked out, my voice raw, barely recognizable. Something is happening here. The map. The house. A pause. "Reid? Are you all right? You sound unwell." "No, listen to me," I pleaded, the words tumbling out, frantic and disjointed. "The map, it's alive. The house. There's something here. Things are moving on their own." Another, longer pause. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the line. Then, his voice, carefully modulated, devoid of its usual warmth. "Reid, perhaps you should take a break. Get some rest. You've been working on that ancestral property for weeks, haven't you? Old houses can play tricks on the mind." "Tricks? This isn't a trick." The door just slammed, the lights are flickering. I heard it speak. "Reid," he said, his tone now firm, laced with an undeniable skepticism. "I think you need to step away from the project. Clear your head." The line went dead. Not a hang-up, but a sudden, abrupt cut-off, as if a wire had been severed. My last lifeline, severed. Alone. You are alone. With us. I stumbled backward, until my back hit the cold stone of the wall. My breath hitched, a ragged sound in the suffocating quiet. The map lay on the desk, its faded lines seeming to writhe, its symbols pulsing with a faint, internal light. It demanded completion. The map, with its faint, internal luminescence, had burned itself into my mind's eye. Its incomplete symbols screamed for resolution, a silent, insistent clamor that drowned out all other thoughts. I, Reid, the meticulous cartographer, had always sought patterns, connections, the hidden architecture of the world. Now, the map offered a pattern too vast, too terrifying to comprehend from the confines of the estate. I needed anchors, forgotten histories, the dusty, overlooked fragments of knowledge that might illuminate its sinister geometry. It was a stark, jarring contrast to the damp, earthy breath of the estate, yet the gnawing dread had followed me, a shadow clinging to my periphery. I had secured temporary access to a specialized archival section, a place where forgotten languages and obscure historical records were catalogued by an aging, meticulous archivist who barely registered my presence. My makeshift workspace was a small, uncluttered cubicle, its beige fabric walls absorbing sound, creating a pocket of oppressive quiet. I dared not bring the original, its potent presence too overwhelming for this anodyne environment. Instead, I pored over my own rendering, comparing its cryptic markings to the various codices and linguistic dictionaries I'd amassed. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the shifting quality of the artificial light and the distant, muffled clatter of a cleaning cart. My fingers, stained with archival dust, traced intricate glyphs and archaic script. The archivist, a stooped figure with spectacles perched on his nose, had given me a peculiar, sidelong glance when I'd requested certain texts, volumes on pre-Roman regional folklore, obscure agrarian rituals, and the forgotten languages of the early indigenous tribes. A particular phrase, recurring in several disparate texts, began to coalesce in my mind, forming a pattern I couldn't ignore. The slumbering earth heart. The bound one. The ever-hungry root. Each mention was accompanied by symbols eerily similar to those on my map, not identical, but resonant, like echoes across centuries. My breath caught, a dry rasp in my throat. This wasn't a treasure map. It was a prison plan. A diagram of a seal. The revelation struck me with the force of a physical blow. The estate wasn't merely built on ancient land, it was built over something. Something immense, something other. The text spoke of a primeval intelligence, a consciousness vast and terrible, predating human memory, buried deep beneath the earth. And the map, my ancestral map, was not a guide to finding it. It was a blueprint for its containment. Or, perhaps, for its release. The texts hinted at a lineage of guardians, those tasked with maintaining the seal, with understanding its intricate mechanisms. My family. My ancestors. Had they been the wardens, or the unwitting jailers? And why had the map been left incomplete? I found a passage in a crumbling, leather-bound journal, its script so faded I had to hold it at an angle to the fluorescent light, my eyes straining. It spoke of the weakening of the stone heart, of the tremors of awakening, of the slow seep of influence. The seal was failing. A low hum, not from the building's ventilation system but seeming to resonate from within the very floor, vibrated through my chair. The air in my cubicle grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence, a pressure on my skin. My skin prickled. Was it just my imagination, or was the malevolent force reaching for me, even across the miles? The map demanded completion. But to complete it meant to either reinforce. The failing seal, an impossible task for a lone cartographer, or, terrifyingly, to inadvertently dismantle the last vestiges of its ancient prison. I, Reid, had been drawn to the estate not by chance, but by a lineage stretching back into the forgotten past, a lineage now burdened with a terrible, impossible inheritance. A demand from something ancient, hungry, and slowly, inexorably, stirring beneath the land. I looked at the copied diagram, the intricate lines now clear, now horrifying. The weight of my discovery pressed down on me, suffocating. I was not merely an inheritor of an estate, I was the inheritor of a prison, and its prisoner was beginning to stir. I, Reid, the meticulous cartographer, had always sought patterns, connections, the hidden architecture. And now, that architecture was screaming back. I had fled the estate, or at least, I had tried to. The city, with its cacophony of sirens and the ceaseless grind of human industry, offered no solace. Here, amidst the muted clicking of keyboards and the hushed drone of distant conversations, I hoped to ground myself, to find a logical explanation in the stark, unyielding logic of urban life. But the map had followed me. Not physically, but as a psychic impression, a phantom sensation of its textured parchment beneath my fingertips. The incomplete symbols now pulsed behind my eyes, a rhythmic throb that mimicked a hidden heart. I tried to focus on the screens before me, on the mundane data of historical land use, but the lines on my monitor blurred, reforming into the map's unsettling contours. A shiver traced my spine, not from a draft, but from a whisper that seemed to curl from the empty cubicle beside me. It was not a sound I could pin down, more a vibration against my eardrums, a suggestion of a voice that spoke in no known tongue, yet conveyed an unmistakable hunger. It felt like dry earth crumbling, like roots tearing at stone. My breath hitched. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my hands against them, as if to physically erase the map's image. But the internal glow intensified, and with it, a cold, invading presence began to seep into my awareness. It wasn't a thought, not truly, but an undeniable pull.
A deep, resonant yearning, not for me, but through me. My chest tightened, a vice grip compressing my ribs.
I felt a fleeting, terrifying sensation of not being entirely alone in my own skull.
A foreign intention, ancient and predatory, brushed against my own consciousness, testing the boundaries, searching for purchase.
It was a silent, insidious invasion, like cold water seeping into porous rock.
My hands, resting on the keyboard, twitched, as if an invisible puppeteer were attempting to flex my fingers.
It promised to fill the emptiness I hadn't even known was there, to resolve the questions that gnawed at my cartographer's soul. Driven by a sudden, frantic need to understand, to fight, I abandoned my screen. My gaze fell upon an old, leather-bound book I'd brought from the estate, tucked away in my messenger bag, a dusty volume on local folklore and forgotten agricultural practices, something I'd grabbed on impulse. My fingers, guided by an instinct that felt both alien and utterly mine, found a brittle, yellowed page near the back. My eyes scanned the cramped script, each word a slow, painful revelation. It was a ritual, a countermeasure.
A final act. A reconciliation of spirit and soil, it called it. My breath caught.
The text was veiled in archaic language, but the meaning, once glimpsed, was terrifyingly clear. To reseal the entity, to return it to its slumber, demanded not just my meticulous cartographic skill in arranging the land, but a profound personal sacrifice. Not of blood, not directly, but something far more intimate, more shattering. It spoke of the offering of the true sight, the relinquishing of self for the greater ground.
It wasn't my life it wanted, not exactly. It wanted my connection.
My perception, my very way of seeing the world, my identity as the one who understood patterns, who
mapped the hidden. This wasn't just about my sanity, or even my life.
The text hinted at a broader consequence, a spreading corruption that would taint the land beyond the estate, a slow, insidious rot that would seep into the very foundations of the world, twisting growth, silencing life. The fate of the land, and perhaps something far wider, rested on my actions.
My family's legacy was not just stone and soil, but this ancient, terrible burden.
It was a wordless plea, a command, a promise of unspeakable power if I yielded, if I simply allowed myself to be its conduit. But the book, brittle and fragile in my hands, offered a different path, a terrible choice, a profound act of will, a sacrifice that would leave me irrevocably changed, but might save everything else. The map had sought resolution, and now, so did I, but the cost. The cost was almost unbearable to contemplate. The whisper, a silken cord woven from earth and shadow, promised completion.
Not just of the map, but of me.
It offered to fill the hollow I now saw at my own core, a void I had carried unknowingly, a hunger mirroring its own. My hands, though steady, felt alien, the skin stretched taut over knuckles that ached with a premonition of strain.
I would descend. I must.
The journey began in the familiar, decaying grandeur of the estate, but the deeper I ventured, the more the house itself seemed to shed its skin of domesticity. The grand staircase, usually creaking with age, now groaned with an almost organic agony. The passage narrowed, the rough-hewn walls pressing in, their surfaces slick with an unseen moisture. I lowered the lantern, its frail light dancing over carved symbols I couldn't decipher, but which pulsed with a latent, unsettling energy. Then, without warning, the stone gave way to something impossibly sterile. I blinked, the lantern beam now cutting through a landscape of muted beige and gray.
Rows upon rows of identical workstations stretched into a hazy distance, each one a shallow grave for ambition.
The fluorescent lights above, though flickering, cast a sickly, unwavering glow that bleached all color from the world.
This wasn't real. It couldn't be. My breath hitched in my throat, tasting of the phantom, recycled air. The walls, once rough stone, were now plasterboard. The floor, once damp earth, was thin, worn carpet. The entity. I pressed my palms against my temples, the fluorescent hum drilling into my skull. No. This is not real. When I opened them again, the cubicles wavered, their edges blurring, the phantom hum distorting into a guttural growl. Slowly, agonizingly, the sterile landscape began to peel away, like a skin shedding. The gray partitions fractured, revealing glimpses of rough stone beneath. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the return of the suffocating, earthy air. It had tried to drown me in the mundane, to make me doubt the reality of my quest. But it had failed. I pushed deeper, the passage spiraling downwards. The walls now bore not just carved symbols, but grotesque, bas-relief figures, their forms distorted, limbs elongated, mouths agape in silent screams. They were not merely decorations, they were warnings, or perhaps, tributes. Stop this, Reid. Turn back. The completion you seek, it is not here. It is with me. I can grant you peace. I can grant you understanding. All this effort, all this pain. For what? A broken lineage? A forgotten curse? Let it go. Let me take it. A flicker of a different life played at the edges of my vision, a sun-drenched field, the laughter of a stranger, a sense of likeness I hadn't known existed. It was a beautiful lie, crafted to tempt me from my grim purpose. I tightened my grip on the lantern, the metal biting into my palm. The pain was real, a grounding anchor in the swirling chaos. The passage opened into a vast, echoing chamber, its ceiling lost in the gloom. In the center, a raised dais of rough-hewn stone, stained black with time and something else, stood like an altar. And on its surface, beneath a thick layer of dust, I saw it. The reveal. They depicted not a ritual of offering, but a ritual of binding, a containment. And at the center of the tablets, a single, deep impression, perfectly sized for a human hand. My hand. Complete it. Break the seal. Release. The air vibrated with an immense, ancient power, a hunger that had been caged, waiting. I stood at the precipice, the braided cord heavy in my other hand, my destiny laid bare on the black stone. I had come this far. There was no turning back. The pain, a sharp, insistent bite from the lantern's metal rim, was my anchor. It tethered me to a grim purpose, to a reality I had chosen over the fleeting, sun-drenched lie. Yet, the scene before me was no less a deception. Fluorescent tubes, sickly yellow-white, hummed overhead, casting long, flat shadows that stretched like skeletal fingers across the low, gray partitions. Each cubicle, an identical box of beige fabric and laminate, stood empty, a silent testament to 1,000 unfulfilled tasks. This was its final gambit, then. Not a monstrous cavern, but a psychological labyrinth, a reflection of the very precision I sought to wield against it. The entity, shapeless and insidious, had pulled me into a space designed to strip individuality, to crush the spirit under an avalanche of sameness. They spoke of rest, of surrendering the burden,
of the sweet oblivion of simply stopping. My eyes, trained to find meaning in lines and boundaries, scanned the grid of cubicles. This wasn't chaos, it was a perverse, enforced order, a map of human containment. And within this map, I knew, lay the key. The ancient, incomplete parchment, the one I had meticulously studied, its cryptic symbols and hidden pathways, surged into my mind with crystalline clarity. It wasn't just about geographical features, it was about the pattern of confinement, the geometry of restriction. The entity's presence solidified, not into a form, but into an unbearable pressure, a crushing weight on my chest that stole the very breath from my lungs. The cubicle walls seemed to press inward, the fluorescent hum deepened into a resonant throb that vibrated through my bones. It sought to unravel the meticulous threads of my sanity, to make me one with the empty, forgotten spaces around me. But I was a cartographer. I understood boundaries. I understood the power of a line drawn with intent. The map had revealed not a weakness of strength, but a weakness of structure. The entity, anathema to definition, could be contained by the very precision it abhorred. My ritual would be an act of mapping, of imposing an unyielding grid upon the formless. I moved, my steps echoing eerily on the synthetic carpet. The map in my mind became a living blueprint. The cubicle aisles, the intersections, the very desks themselves, transformed into points on a vast, unseen diagram. I began to trace the lines, not with chalk or ink, but with the sheer force of my will, guided by the ancient knowledge. I used the mundane objects around me, a forgotten stapler, a discarded pen, a stack of blank paper, imbuing them with symbolic weight. Each placement was precise, a calculated node in the intricate web I was weaving. As I worked, the entity raged. Illusions flickered at the edge of my vision, the faces of forgotten ancestors, contorted in agony, then the fleeting image of that sun-drenched field, the stranger's laughter, beckoning me to abandon my grim task. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the phantom warmth, the spectral pleas. The pain from the lantern, now a familiar companion, kept me grounded. Then, I spoke. My voice, raw and hoarse, recited the ancient words, not of power, but of definition. They were words of containment, of boundaries, of the immutable laws of space and form. The entity shrieked, a sound that seemed to tear the very air, rattling the cubicle walls, threatening to shatter the fragile reality I had constructed. The pressure intensified, 1,000 invisible hands clawing at my mind, trying to pull me apart. But I held fast. The words flowed, a relentless tide of order. The grid I had imposed, the map I had drawn with intention and will, solidified. I felt a tremendous snap, not of something breaking, but of something locking into place. A profound silence descended, heavier and more absolute than before. The fluorescent lights glowed with a steady, if still sickly, pallor. The cubicle stood, silent and empty, no longer threatening, but simply contained. The entity was gone, or rather, it was here, sealed within the very structure I had woven. But the cost. The cost was immediate, profound. The world, once a vibrant tapestry of shifting colors and nuanced emotions, now appeared to me as a series of interlocking grids, of lines and boundaries. My own thoughts, once fluid and meandering, now moved with the precise, almost mechanical rhythm of a compass needle finding true north. The flicker of a different life, the sun-drenched field, the laughter, it was not merely gone, but erased. The very concept of such likeness, such unmapped joy, had been purged from my being. I had become the map, the container, the unyielding boundary. I had contained the entity, yes, but in doing so, I had mapped myself into a new, sterile existence. The victory was absolute, and the emptiness it left behind was boundless. I was free, and utterly, irrevocably alone within the confines of my own meticulously ordered mind. Viscous, gray expanse. My eyes, crusted and slow, fought against the searing fluorescent glare that poured from a grid of overhead panels. The musty stone of the hidden chamber, the damp earth, the primal reek of ancient things, all were gone. My body, a collection of throbbing aches and raw wounds, lay sprawled on a carpet of industrial gray, a fabric coarse against my cheek. The pain, a dull constant thrumming, was a familiar companion now, a low echo of the greater agony that had just passed. I pushed myself up, my limbs screaming, my vision swimming with phantom light. Rows of identical workstations stretched out before me, a desolate cityscape of fabric-covered partitions. Empty chairs, their black casters glinting, sat pushed in or askew. Each cubicle was a miniature tomb, a monument to forgotten tasks. A monitor on a distant desk flickered with a screensaver, a slow dance of geometric shapes, a silent testament to a life that continued, indifferent, elsewhere. The only sound was the low, persistent hum of the HVAC system, a mechanical breath that filled the vast, deserted space. It was a sound devoid of life, yet pregnant with an unsettling quietude, the kind that follows a scream. My clothes were torn, caked with drying mud and something else, something darker, that I dared not examine too closely. A jagged gash ran along my forearm, crusted and angry, a testament to the lantern's brutal embrace. My fingers, stiff and trembling, traced the line of it. The pain was real, profoundly, sickeningly real. But the rest. Where was the estate? Where was the crushing weight of the earth above me, the damp, cold breath of the hidden place? A tremor ran through me, not of fear, but of profound disorientation. Had I dreamed it all? Was this the final, most insidious trick? I forced myself to stand, my legs protesting with a weak shudder. There was a faint sheen to my skin, a subtle pallor that was not merely pallor, but something else, like the thin film on stagnant water. And my left temple. The entity was gone. The air, though stale, no longer carried the metallic tang of its hunger. The silence was absolute, a void where its whispers had once coiled. But the silence was not peace. It was the aftermath of an explosion, the ringing in the ears after a deafening roar. It was the quiet of a grave. And I was not unscathed. I stumbled between the cubicles, each identical, each an empty vessel. The sense of isolation here, amidst the remnants of 1,000 mundane lives, was more profound than in the deepest catacombs. No one knew. No one would ever know. This desolate floor, these silent workstations, were a stark counterpoint to the cosmic horror I had faced, a brutal reminder of the world's blissful ignorance. A distant hum, more mechanical than the HVAC, pulled me towards a window. The glass was grimy, streaked with the accumulated grime of forgotten seasons. Beyond, the familiar, yet now alien, landscape of the estate stretched out under a sky of bruised gray. The old house stood, a shattered silhouette against the horizon, its ancient stones scarred, one wing collapsed inwards like a broken limb. The meticulously maintained gardens were ravaged, churned earth and splintered trees marking the path of some unseen force. The land itself bore wounds, deep fissures running through the soil, as if the earth had screamed in its agony. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a hallucination.
The office building floor was merely a purgatorial interlude, a brief, agonizing moment of transition from one nightmare to the next. The true aftermath lay outside, visible in the ruin of my ancestral home. My hand instinctively went to my temple, to the subtle mark that throbbed with a faint, internal pulse. A fragment. A memory. A resonance. I was Reid, the cartographer. But the old maps in my mind had been torn, redrawn by a force that cared nothing for boundaries or human sanity. And the cost. The outside world would continue its oblivious dance, but I carried the ruin within me, a silent, internal catastrophe. The searing fluorescent glare, a grid of indifferent panels, poured down upon me. My eyes, crusted and slow, fought against the artificial luminescence, a stark, brutal contrast to the ancient gloom that had so recently been my world. In their place stood an office building floor with too many cubicles, a landscape of beige partitions and hushed keyboard clicks that felt alien, a cruel, mocking parody of order. A tremor ran through my hand, startling in its intensity. I looked down at it, at the familiar lines of my palm, and found it alien. The air, conditioned and recycled, tasted of dust and stale coffee, a thin veil over a deeper, more profound absence. I missed the damp, the loam, the chill that had permeated the estate's walls and, for a time, my very bones. They had brought me back. The detective, his gaze sharper than I remembered, had spoken of a disorientation, a brief episode. My colleagues, when they dared to meet my eyes, offered sympathetic nods, their expressions a careful blend of concern and a peculiar, unsettling distance. They saw Reid, the meticulous cartographer, returned from his inherited folly. But they did not see the vast, gray expanse that still shimmered behind my eyelids, nor the price exacted by its ancient hunger. The weight of the map, the one I had so painstakingly sought to complete, pressed in on me even here. I sat at my desk, surrounded by the comforting, predictable tools of my trade, compasses, rulers, the delicate ink pens that had once been my solace. But now, as my fingers traced the familiar contours of a projected landscape, I found myself anticipating the tremor, the subtle shift in focus that would turn a mountain range into a looming maw, a river into a winding vein of sacrifice. I remembered the surge, the terrifying, exhilarating release. The earth had sung a low, guttural song, and I, a conduit, had offered something. The memories were fractured, shards of obsidian and bone, but the feeling asterisk remained, a profound emptiness where a part of me, vital and unknowable, had been. The entity was not gone. It was merely satiated, for a time, and its tendrils, unseen yet undeniable, now wove through the very fibers of my existence. I had not escaped. I was bound. It was the smell of damp iron, of soil turned over after centuries, and it would steal my breath, dragging me back to the echoing chamber, to the viscous, gray expanse that had demanded its due. They were not words, not precisely, but a resonance, a deep, earthbound vibration that spoke of ancient pacts and unending patience. My work, once a precise dance of lines and symbols, now felt like a desperate attempt to impose order on a chaos I had unleashed. Each contour, each elevation mark, became a line of defense, a ward against the forces that stirred beneath the land. I was its sentinel. Its unwilling guardian. The price I had paid was not merely my peace of mind, nor even the fragments of my sanity that had scattered like dust. It was the knowledge, the unshakable certainty, that the world held depths no map could ever truly chart. I finished my work each day, walked the sterile corridors, and returned to my small, quiet apartment.
The mundane rhythms of life continued, a thin veneer over the unsettling truth. I ate, I slept, I even managed to string conversation or two with a colleague about the latest office politics. But beneath it all, a constant hum of tension thrummed. The horror was contained, yes, but it was not over. It lived within me now, a silent, demanding presence, waiting for the next tremor, the next crack in the fragile surface of the world. And I, its unwitting keeper, knew that my true work had only just begun.